Welcome to Crime in Court. This is the transcript read through of the 1996 Menendez Brothers Trial, California versus Erik and Lyle Menendez. We unfortunately don't have video because that was one of the rulings that was different in this case, was that Judge Weisberg decided that cameras didn't need to be in the courtroom for their second trial, even though the entire first trial was streamed from gavel to gavel on court TV. So the second trial was done in more secrecy, which is why I gathered the transcripts and we are going to read through some witness testimony and definitely testimony that we didn't hear in the first trial. So witnesses that we did not hear from or see come up on the stand. So we're going to hear from their perspectives. Also, oh yeah, one second. Let me flip screens here. Hold on. So before we get into our reading, I created a Google Drive, a Google folder. Make that much bigger. That's better. So I created a Google folder which has all of the appellate and resentencing documents, all of the trial transcripts. I'm going to load them periodically. They're not all in there right now, but as we go through the trial, I'll upload for you guys to go along for stuff that we might not cover. And then I also created this spreadsheet. So this is who we have coming up for our first witnesses regarding the state's case. So this is, like it says, the state's case. We did the prosecution's opening statement. I read through that already in a previous video, which will be in the same folder. I've created a folder for this, so it's a separate folder than the one that you were going to if you were watching the trial. So yeah, that's on my page now on YouTube. Rumble, sorry guys, I don't have folders and whatnot, but anyways, so we're going to like I said, here are the witnesses. So I just wanted to go over with you the witnesses. I also put on here for you our attorneys. So for the people of California, we've got Gil Garcetti, Carol Nahara, and David Kahn. Whoops, I spelled that wrong. It is David. And then for Lyle Menendez, we have Michael Judge, Charles Gessler, Terry Towery. For Erik Menendez, Leslie Abramson is back. She's the only one that returns. And then she brought in another attorney, Barry Levin, to help her with adjudicating Erik's case. And then the presiding judge is the same judge, Stanley Weisberg, the same biased judge who didn't want stuff about the SACA coming in to trial. He appeared to conflict heavily with Leslie Abramson, who's back, by the way. So, how's that going to play out? It appears that a lot of you do want to hear some of the arguments. So, I'll pick and choose, which arguments. I'm not going to go through all the arguments, but if there's a good argument or something that's really relevant as to something coming in or not, I'll kind of go over those arguments too as we go along. So the first, um, excuse me, the first poll that I had out there for you guys was, should we go over Detective Leslie Zeller's testimony? That's on my YouTube page. If you want to, under the community tab on my YouTube page, if you want to give your input. I'm asking, do you want his full testimony, just portions of his testimony, or do you want me to skip him altogether? So depending on the poll results, what you guys want, we'll do that. He is on the stand for quite a bit of time, so I'm just letting you know it will be a lengthy, whatever, but I'll get through it if you guys want me to do it. So either way, doesn't matter to me. Let me know. go give that a vote so we can make sure that I'm doing what you guys would like to hear. So then, uh, just for reference, I haven't decided yet how I'm going to handle all the polls and everything coming. I might do, who out of all of law enforcement do we want to hear? I do want to go over Perry Berman's testimony, also Clara White and Randolph Wright, who are new witnesses. Couldn't think of the word there. Sorry. So new witnesses that we had not heard from trial one. So we'll go through their testimony as well. These are all the individuals that we're going to hear from in, technically it's like the first full week. But week one starts with opening statements and Detective Zoller. So then week two, we are over here with all of these individuals. I'll figure out, keep an eye out for polls on my page and we will go from there. But just to kind of give you an overview of this chart, let me see if I can shrink it just slightly because it's kind of running off the page here. All right, so it goes month. Actually, I didn't even put months. This is going to be what week it is. So let's change that. Sorry, it's week. And then all of the dates are going to be here as to who did what on what day. So Detective Leslie Zeller, as you can see, he testifies from October 12th through the 16th. He's the lead investigator from Beverly Hills. I put occupational relation to the defendants. So that's where you're going to find a description of who the witness is. And then, so it says, it starts on October 12th for Leslie Zoller. So his testimony, his direct testimony starts here on page 59 of the October 12th um, trial transcript, which you can find I'm going to put them in by month. So you'll find it here under the tabs. And I'm giving out the links as well. So you guys can follow along if you want. And like I said, go back and look at things. These are the appellate records. We've gone through all of these. I thought that I didn't go over the resentencing request, but I actually did when it came out. So I thought that I had more stuff to go over before getting to trial two, just in case I mentioned it. I'm not sure if I said, like, look for this because it's coming. I actually did the resentencing request and the letters from George Gascon, the previous DA of Los Angeles County. He wrote letters to request clemency from the governor. So I went through those on a previous stream of the trial. So I will try to pick that out. I have no idea which one it is. So I'll have to go back, look for that, and like make it a separate video for you guys. So I'll try to do that. So um anyways. All right, so that's kind of how I see this going. You guys can follow along, give your input, all the good stuff. So hopefully, this isn't just some dry, boring transcript reading of mine. You guys can follow along and, you know, decide what we listen to. So, like I said, you'll find links when I post stuff. Whenever I post a video, you'll find the link below for all of those folders. All right, so let's begin with the opening statement. Also, just quick reminder, I have bookmarks on all of them so you can find like the opening statement of the prosecution started on page 52, so I could just click on it. And now, oops, I lost my spot. I could go back to the Erik opening statement. That was the other thing that I forgot to mention in my last video. So, before I get started, so many housekeeping items that like come to me as I'm talking. Um, so we don't have two juries in this. If you watched the trial, the 1993 trial with me, there were two separate juries for one for Erik, one for Lyle, and each one decided their fate separately. This time around, we have one jury, but we still have two sets of attorneys one for Lyle, one for Erik, you're going to see a huge discrepancy in the fight that Ms. Abramson puts in versus the fight that I believe the public defender assigned to Lyle is going to put in. Leslie, I also believe she stayed on for a lower rate. I think at first the judge was going to make her like if she wanted to stay on because she didn't want to leave Erik. She's like, every person in Erik's life has abandoned him. I don't want to leave him, especially at this time in his life when he needs someone the most. So she stuck around with him and remained on in as his lawyer. I think the judge wanted to have her do it pro bono. And can you imagine that? Like this trial took like 6 months or something. Can you, or even longer with deliberations and whatnot. It's like it goes on for like 26 weeks. So yeah, that's a long time. That's a long ass time. It's half a year almost or more. That's more than half a year. But anyways, so yeah, why like I think he wanted her to be pro bono, but eventually I think she just like lowered her rates or something. She had to go for like lower wages just to stay on. But she did it because she really put in a good fight for, if you watch the first trial, she was awesome in her arguments, and I like hearing strong women stand their ground and be effective in their arguments. And you might call her, some choice words. I'm sure Judge Weisberg wanted to call her some choice words at the end of some of those days in trial one, but you got to give her credit for standing her ground and fighting like hell for her client. And with that, let's get started. So please hit that like button before we begin, and away we go. So this is opening statement for Erik only. So we'll have a separate opening for Lyle with his attorneys doing that. So this is Leslie Abramson, opening statement for Erik. Good afternoon. I'm very pleased that the judge again reminded you that opening statements aren't evidence because you're sitting in this position where you have to hear two really separate cases at the same time. There are two people on trial here. You know how serious these charges are. We've talked about all those things during the jury selection process, and what you have to do as a juror in this case is separately consider and weigh the separate evidence that will be coming in from both the prosecution side of the case and the defense side of the case as to each one of our four clients, or each one of our clients. Sorry, I don't know where I got four. Blah, blah, blah. Great, Heather, we're already starting out bad. Not really. I think I'm fresh from a good night's sleep, and hopefully my words work, even though my voice is like sounds groggy and dry, so I apologize. One of our clients, and no one thinks that's easy, but we picked you, and that indicates we believe you can do it. You have to sort of, though, be mentally rigorous about the process. In his opening just now, Mr. Khan, I'm sure, to save time and for whatever reason, didn't make those distinctions for you. He talked about, for example, Lyle Menendez did or Erik Menendez did that, and much of that is not what we call cross admissible. It's what Lyle Menendez does or said it's what Lyle Menendez does or said to some extent in this case. You can only consider against him. What Erik Menendez does and said, you can only consider against him. So that's one of the many reasons why you cannot take impressions that you may get from opening statements and try to use them eventually in making your decision in this case. It's really hard. Once you hear something, it's really hard to unhear it. Even if you hear this warning later saying basically the prosecutor is embellishing what they're saying or not being totally truthful with you. So what he just said behind. It's really hard to do that when they're the first ones that speak and they get to tell you their narrative, and that's often the one that you believe first then because you heard it first. Unless it like totally doesn't make sense to you, you're going to probably be like, "Oh, okay, I'm kind of on board here already before the trial even begins with your opening statement." Anyway, the other reason is because we all live in what's known as linear times. You can't hear both sides at the same time. As one side goes first and one side second. If you make up your mind, given the first thing you hear, the second side may as well leave the courtroom and go home because you're never going to hear them. Exactly like what I just said. You hear the first version and you stick with that, and then the second version is like that, but that contradicts what I already know. But you don't know that as fact. And how many times did the judge have to interject and say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, may I remind you that what the lawyers say in opening statements is not fact or evidence. He said it quite a few times. There were a few objections there. The other reason is because we all live in what's known in linear times, blah, blah, blah. I said that. If you make up your minds, given the first thing you hear the second time, we will all leave the courtroom and go home. Exactly. So the defense goes second in a criminal case because the prosecution representing the state, the government, has the burden of proof. And because they have the burden, they have to come forward with evidence with which they hope to convince you that the charges they filed are supported by evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, you get to, hold on, let me make sure I have my highlighter selected. Now, you get to go second. We get to go second. And as you know, it's going to take several months to try this case. So I am hopeful that in spite of the fact that you've just been shown some things that would upset anybody, and heard some things that sound terrible, that you realize you didn't see or hear anything that is evidence yet. And until it's all before you, you have to try to do something that's very hard to do. Keep an open mind so that you can weigh it all and sift it all in the end. I'm going to read this to you because I'm going to I'm going to be reading this to you because this case is complicated and because I'm very mindful of the rules of evidence. unlike unlike the prosecutor. Dig. It's very large type, so it won't take as long as it looks. Newsflash, this is only part one of two, so it is going to be long, but considering that it's Leslie, I'm not shocked because she can take some time to. I'm not saying that she's long winded, but I believe that she takes her time to effectively argue and give background information. All right, so I'm going to be reading this to you because this case is complicated and because I'm very mindful of the rules of evidence. It's in very large type. So, okay. I think one thing that should be obvious to you, even from Mr. Khan's brief recitation, is that this is a very complicated case, and to understand the defense in this case, you must allow yourselves to learn about things most of us would prefer to never have heard about. One thing that should be obvious to you is there's going to be a lot of talk about gruesome, grisly things, bullet wounds, broken bones, blood. I mean, it's grisly. But what you will learn is that as you listen to the evidence in a scientific point of view, as you hear scientific experts who are trained in these areas talk about it, the shock reaction goes away and it begins to then become evidence and not something simply to inflame you. Damn. She's like, the prosecution is just trying to stir up your anger, get you emotional about it, but we're going to teach you the science and we're going to teach you the actual circumstances of this case. We're going to give it to you plain and simple. The other thing that if you're going to be open-minded jurors in this case, you have to be willing to listen to and hopefully willing to learn about in the systematic abuse of children and the distorting, the complicated effect it has, the maltreatment on the minds of its victims. Now, as I told you for the defense, the purpose of making an opening statement is to let you know that more evidence will be produced in this case than the prosecution puts on, and that you have to consider our evidence before forming any opinions or reaching any conclusions. State goes first, we go second. You can't form an opinion until after we begin our case. We will present evidence bearing on what I think you will find very clearly are the real issues in this case. From what we represent, you will learn that there is no dispute over who took the lives of Mr. and Mrs. Menendez. Their sons took their lives. What our evidence will address is why they took their lives and why they were offed. We will show, for lack of a better term, I can't, I'm sorry, YouTube restrictions. We will show you is important because that tells you so why uh, the why they were offed. Yeah, is the why part of it is going to be very important because that tells you what was the state of mind of their sons in that time that led up to that point. And that is important because it is a crucial issue in the law of homicide. Now, before I get to that state of mind and how it was formed, I just want to give you a history. Barry, would you get the poster boards with the houses, please? It's over by Nancy. Thank you. The court says, Mr. Levine, you can see Ms. Slonaker over there, and Mr. Abramson says, Mr. Levine, it should be obvious, also represents Erik Menendez along with myself. We are co-counsel in that regard, and you will see over the course of the trial that we share the duties. I'm speaking to you today. You will see that he is dealing with witnesses, and that we expect that he's going to be the attorney who calls Erik Menendez to the stand and examines him because our client will indeed testify in this case. We're not going to be playing any mystery games with you at all. So that could be taken like Lyle's team might be playing some mystery games, but I can see her being like, well, I meant the state playing games, but I don't know. I was gonna say something now and I forgot. Oh, oh. So having Mr. Levine or Levin, I think it's Levin, I'm pronouncing it wrong, Mr. Levin, having him do the questioning of Erik is probably smart because in the first, I thought she was great. Personally, I thought she was amazing. But I could see how she could rub people the wrong way and how she can come off kind of abrasive. Because she really she doesn't care if she hurts her feelings when she asks a question or she says something. She just doesn't care. She wants the truth. She wants justice. So I could see why she could come off abrasive and why they would have wanted to bring in another attorney to do the questioning for some of the witnesses, especially Erik, to make it maybe he has a softer approach, maybe he's more likable and is examining, who knows, whatever the reasons are. I do know that Leslie afterwards did like a uh, what a focus group. There's the word I was looking for. She did a focus group with some of the jurors that were willing to participate in it after the trial had concluded in 1993. She invited them, I believe, over to her home, and she was doing a focus group, trying to see like what things she could improve because she intended on, retrying the case or representing him on the retrial. So I think maybe that was a suggestion that maybe she was a little too harsh and they didn't like her doing the questioning. Although I think she was good for Erik because she was softer in her approach with Erik and he trusted her immensely, so he was able to be very, very vulnerable on the stand. So I think it was good. I think personally it worked out for me, but I'm also on board with the defense's theory, so I don't know. Maybe I'm just biased. But anyways, let's move on. So now I want to first relate to you though. You know what? I'm going to keep it here. I can just hold them up. These are very light. This is a history of the Menendez family as it will be given by witness in this trial so that you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out these sort of demographic things. Erik Menendez, my client, was born on November 27th, 1970. His older brother Lyle was born on on January 10th, 1968. He just had a birthday. We all wished him happy birthday on social media. They were the only children of Jose Enrique and Mary Louise Menendez. You have heard Mrs. Menendez referred to as Kitty. That was her nickname. Jose Menendez was a Cuban born immigrant who, over the course of his children's lives, was an ever more successful and ever higher business executive. Mrs. Menendez taught school for a few years in New York City, but became full-time homemaker when Erik was born. So she taught. Okay. That's kind of scary knowing she was around children. Although we don't know what age, but still. When Erik Menendez was born and family lived in Cedar Grove, New Jersey, a very modest little house you can see here in the snow. There are taken from old family photographs, which is why they're not high tech. When Erik was just a few months old, the family moved to Illinois. Shout out Illinois. I live in Illinois, Chicago area. So they moved to Illinois to this house, a suburb called Hinsdale, which is a very nice area right outside of Chicago. And at the time that the Menendez family moved to the Chicago area, Mr. Menendez's sister, whose name is Teresita Baralt, and her husband, Carlos Baralt, also moved to New Jersey. In fact, a block away, because Mr. Menendez was taking over a company and he was going to employ his brother in law, Carlos Baralt, in that company. So, living in Illinois, they lived next to Mr. Menendez's sister, Teresita Baralt, and her husband, Carlos Baralt. So, that's family. Hinsdale, like I said, is a nice area, and there's some really pretty homes. None of the homes look alike. They're all different, unique. They're very nice looking. Um, I would only know because I drive through the area to get to my doctor. All right, so where are we at? Okay, so Carlos Baralt, Teresita Baralt, married. Teresita is Mr. Menendez's sister. However, things did not work out with the company in Illinois. The family only lived in that area less than 2 years. So, shortly before Erik Menendez's second birthday, and the family moved again. So, so I wonder what happened to the Baralts. Did they stay in Illinois? I should try to look that up. Not that I'm stalking them, I just wonder. All right, so this time to Muncie, New York, and this photograph here is a picture of the house that they lived in Muncie, New York. At that time, Muncie at that time, sort of a semi-rural area in upstate New York. If you know the shape of the state of New York, it was very close to the New Jersey border on the long bar of the state of New York, quite far away from New York City, where Mr. Menendez worked for the Hertz Corporation and computed. It's supposed to be commuted, I'm sure, daily. It was a house in the woods, and you will hear testimony about what significance of the relative isolation of the house had and about certain things that happened in the woods behind the Monty house. In 1979, when Eric Menendez was going on 7 years old, the family moved again to the Princeton area in New Jersey. It was time Teresita and Carlos Peralt had left. At that time, they left Illinois. Okay, there we go. That solves my answer. I don't have to stalk them. Just kidding. I wasn't stalking them. I was just curious if any of them still had ties to Illinois, but I doubt it now. All right, so had moved, so the Baralt had moved to New Jersey, lived in the Princeton area, and had urged their relatives to move there because it was an easier commute to New York City than Muncie, and they wanted to be together again as family. For 1 year, the Menendez family rented this house, which still looks like that. Still has the white with dark shutters on Mill Road in New Jersey in an area called Princeton Junction, which is close to the university town of Princeton. After that area in 1978, the family built the custom-made house, which is very hard to see because again, it's obscured by the woods, which are all around the house in what we call here Pennington, New Jersey. So they moved around different places within like the same area, it seems. It's just another suburb. Princeton is like a whole series of bedroom communities. This is another suburb of Princeton where they built the house. The house had a tennis court, and this house was on the lake. Oh, sounds nice. Both, but not because of all the nightmares that happened. So, you can't judge a book by its cover. Both the lake and the tennis court filled in largely, I don't know what she's saying, filled the lives in of the development of both brothers while they lived in the house. They lived in that house for quite some time, both of them doing like swimming and tennis and whatnot. I don't know if they swam in the lake, but they definitely weren't swimming at one point. In March of 1986, the Menendez family bought a really gorgeous house. You can see it here, and you'll see lots of other pictures of it. The first really wealthy looking house that they lived in. And this house was actually located inside Princeton Township, yet it was on its own private road, sitting on 7 acres with a private lake. No one to hear you scream. Yikes. And to get there, you had to drive through these very dense woods past the gate, the private part, or the private road part. They moved there, but within 3 months of moving there, Mr. Menendez encountered another situation of trouble at his work. Uh, Hold that thought. Trouble at his work. I'm wondering, because we know that Roy Rossello of the boy band from the 80s, Menudo boy band, 80s and 90s, they were being managed by Jose. We know now that the record industry, the Hollywood, everywhere, there's rampant SA going on in these industries. Could Jose, this was before he made it to the record industry, but he could have, he was CEO or like he held management, he held high positions in these other companies. So it's not unlikely or impossible that he might have used his position and power in this in his other organizations like Hertz and wherever else he might have worked before that. If he used his power in these organizations to SA other employees, individuals, and it's kind of infuriating that if that did happen, no one's come out about it because I mean, especially when there's allegations by the sons who are facing, never seeing the light of day outside of prison walls. So it's just, to me, frustrating because he had to have gotten his start somewhere. Maybe Rory Rosella was this first. Doubtful, but maybe it was, or his only like outside of the family, but likely not. especially in a position of power and making money for companies. So, speaking of the trouble at work. So, he encountered some trouble at work. At that, maybe he was busted essaying someone, or allegations were coming out that he was essaying someone, so Hertz didn't want him anymore. I don't know. Does anybody have any information on this? Because that would be really incredible to find out to help the brothers' case to get out or to be resentenced. So at that time, he worked for RCA Records. He failed to get a promotion that he was maneuvering for and left RCA and secured employment here in California. Oh, so in Jersey, he was at RCA. We didn't get there. Like she skipped from wherever he was working before to RCA. Whoops, that was my nail file I was playing with, just snapped. Sorry about that. It's really loud in the mic. All right, so he left RCA and secured employment here in California for a company called IVE. Whoops, I didn't highlight it all. IVE, which was a subsidiary of a company you probably are more familiar with, which is Carolco Record or Pictures. I don't know, Carolco. Carolco Pictures were the people you will hear who made the Rambo movies, and they still make a lot of action movies. Anyway, with Mr. Menendez now out of RCA and into IVE, the family moved to Los Angeles. So this is the fall of 1986. They moved to Los Angeles less than 3 years before the parents would be taken unalived. I hate that word. I try to not use that word. So if I'm like, I try to say it naturally, like lost his life. So, not that that's funny, but I try to not be joking because I don't want it to sound stupid when you're talking about the loss of life, saying unalived and self-deleted, but we have to, unfortunately, because of YouTube censorship. That's why I get shadow banned on my channel because I say it out loud. All right, so what they did when they moved here was they rented a relatively small house in the valley, the West Valley, in the Calabasas area. In fact, in Calabasas itself. And they lived in the house until 1988. In October of 88, they moved to the house that you're going to get to know very well through charts and diagrams and blueprints, the house in Beverly Hills at 722 Elm Drive. And I have no idea if that home is still standing. I put a post up on X over the weekend explaining that an area that was about 6 miles away from their home was engulfed in flames, days prior to when I had posted that. That was this past weekend. So on Sunday, I think I posted it. So I have no idea, and we won't know because everything is going to be so massively destroyed. So it's going to take a while for us to know which homes survived and which ones didn't. But for now, that's what I know about the wildfires. All right, so now, just so you're not confused, you're also going to hear about another house in Calabasas. What happened when the Menendez family moved here, rented this house, meanwhile went looking for something to buy. And they bought a house on a substantial piece of property in Calabasas and they didn't like it. So they were tearing it down and renovating it, and this did take up a tremendous amount of Mrs. Menendez's time over the next 2 years, and it never got finished. In October of 1988, when they moved to Beverly Hills, that Calabasas house still wasn't finished, even though it was their intention at that time to just sell it. You weren't going to live in two houses, one in Beverly Hills and one in Calabasas. See, at the time that they passed, it is true they had title to two houses. But as you will also find out, they owned more, basically on both of them, than was ever going to be realized by those pieces of properties. they they owed more. They owed more than what they realized by on those properties. A common but unfortunate LA real estate story of the last few years, I think that's supposed to say, of the last few years where people have or aren't able to offload a second home, I guess is what she's talking about. So now in the spring of 1989, while he was living in this house in Beverly Hills, Eric Menendez was accepted into the September 1989 freshman class at UCLA, where he hoped to be playing on the tennis team. In June 1989, Eric graduated from Beverly Hills High School. He had previously attended high school in Calabasas. His last year of high school was at Beverly Hills High School, and you will meet at least one of the teachers who knew him that year at Beverly Hills High. That summer, he went most of the time, in fact, all of the time, until August 9th, training for and competing in what's called the Junior National Tennis Competition, which you will learn there is this whole children's competitive tennis circuit. And over this summer, months of each year, they have a whole series of competition in different parts of the country, a gradual series of eliminations, until they basically play and crown the national junior champions in different age groups, the 14s, the 16s, the 18s. Eric Menendez was 18 that summer, and that was the level, the division that he was playing. And that's the oldest division. And in order to do that, in order to be ready for that, he could spend like a week at a tennis camp drilling and training in Florida, and then he would fly to whatever city the actual playoffs, the competition was for the next week, and his parents would join him at these different competitions. Because as you will hear, they were extremely involved in all of his athletics and all the brothers' athletic activities, and there were many of them over the course of their lives. So that summer, he would be in tennis camps and he'd go to a competition and he'd go back to a tennis camp practicing and drilling and competing. That went on over 3 legs, 3 different venues, and the last leg of the tournament was played in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And his parents returned to Beverly Hills from Kalamazoo on August 9th, 1989, 11 days before the homicides. Now what we will show you, I will show you a little later in my statement, and also we will have testimony in great detail about what happened between August 13th and August 20th, the last week. Between those dates, there was a series of confrontations and crises in the family that theorized the sons had brought about that theorized the sons had brought about the death of their parents, so that on August 20th, 1989, Eric and Lyle Menendez indeed do take the lives of their parents in the den of the house on Elm Drive. Now you've heard the prosecution has charged them with first degree premeditated M word for the homicides, and we intend to show from our evidence that although Eric and Lyle Menendez did take their parents' lives, they did not commit the M word, meaning it was manslaughter, unintentional homicide, not intentionally inflicting bodily harm to the point of losing life on purpose. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess you can argue they did it on purpose, but they did it the purpose was to protect themselves. That's the defense. So now Mr. Khan did not address this in his opening. He talked about the M word, but he didn't talk about how he was going to prove that there was at all, because not all homicides, first of all, not all homicides are crimes. If you take the life of somebody by accident, that's not a crime. If you take somebody's life by excusable mistake, that's not a crime. If you take somebody's life in what we call in this state a perfect self defense, that's not a crime. But to establish that a homicide is a crime, the prosecution has to prove not just the act of taking their lives, but the mental state of the person who took victims' lives. These are things, the type of mental state and the types of homicide that the judge will give you very formalized instruction about at the end of the case. And those instructions have to be your guide through the law. But just in a very general sense, one kind of mental state makes the KILLing a homicide, a M-word homicide. Another kind of mental state makes it a manslaughter homicide. They are both illegal, but the M word of a higher degree of culpability, a higher level of criminality than manslaughter. And the reason is that in the M word, there is an element called malice that does not exist in manslaughter, and that's what the state needs to prove. The fact of the matter is that the single most important issue in this case is why were Mr. and Mrs. Menendez's lives taken by their own children? Because why tells you what was the mental state. Why tells you whether it was at the M word or manslaughter, and manslaughter is all we are asking of you. We are not trying this case seeking to avoid responsibility or trying to pretend that they are not the people who did these crimes. We are not pretending, or we are not trying this case to get up in the end and tell you you must acquit because the glove don't fit. We are just coming off of the O.J. Simpson trial, same county, and they got a massive blow, the prosecution, in the O.J. Simpson trial when he was acquitted. So she is referencing that. And she's referencing that she's not going to say if the glove don't fit, don't acquit, or you must acquit. I mean, she's saying she's not going to say that. So my client is going to get on the witness stand, subject himself to cross-examination, and explain everything within his knowledge and ability to do so about why this happened. And what our evidence will show is that Erik Menendez actually believed, which is the language of the law. I'm going to highlight that. Actually believed that his parents were about to take his life when, in a mental state of terror and panic, he shot them to prevent the loss of his own life. So that you can understand how he came to believe this of his own parents and to feel so extreme a fear of these people who he had lived with his entire life. We will present the observations of numerous witnesses familiar with the treatment that Erik Menendez received at the hands of both of his parents over the course of his life. Through his testimony and that of other witnesses, we will prove to you that he was tortured, terrorized, exploited, molested, and aid. I don't know if I could say any of those other words, but I said them, so whatever. To the extent of such an extent that he lived in a constant state of fear of his parents, and believed that both of them would have and could have taken his life. We will also prove to you that he did not have the ability or the means to escape from his home where he was maltreated. And this is a very important point because a lot of people, and people still today, are like, they were grown adults. Why didn't they just leave? That is the most ignorant thing, one of the most ignorant things you can say, other than, oh, he liked it, obviously, because he's a man and it was another man. So that's the most ignorant thing. The second most ignorant thing is, why didn't they just leave? They were victims of their parents who controlled everything in their lives. Everything. So, how do you escape someone who controls everything? Controls the money, controls your cars, controls everything. You know what I'm saying? So, plus you live in fear of them that if you were to even leave, you would be afraid that if he ever caught you, your punishment would be way worse. So there's that as well. And probably he had threatened them. His father had threatened both Erik and Lyle that if the secret of the family ever came out, he was going to KILL them. So what else are they supposed to believe? But let's move on. All right. So they definitely couldn't escape their home. And anyone who says that is completely ignorant of CASA, the effects of maltreatment done by someone else to you. If you have not been in that situation, you don't know. You don't know what you'll do. You don't know how you'll act. You don't know how you'll feel. And you don't know how perpetrators like that tear down the victim's self esteem, self worth, everything. You don't even think that you have the capabilities, smarts, skills, wherewithal to go out and do anything for yourself because your parents were doing everything for you. They even did their homework. So I don't know how the brothers would have even thought that they could have escaped because perpetrators like Jose are going to make them believe or feel that escaping isn't an option for them. So I'm glad I got that out there. That was in me for a while. I didn't even know it, but it's true. Unless you're in a situation like that, you don't know what's going to happen. I personally speak from experience that I was in a DV relationship and you feel trapped. You feel like you have no resources, and they do that to you on purpose. They put you in that situation on purpose so that you have nowhere to turn. And with that, I will move on. All right. Thank you for listening. That's my little PSA for today. All right. So, our evidence will establish that he could not just leave. He could not just run away. Certainly not before the week of crisis that I will take you through. This week that culminated in the homicides. And during that week, as we hope, you will come to understand that evidence will show why trying to leave seemed far more dangerous than staying. Exactly. It's a more dangerous option to the victim to leave. Witnesses will describe how the effects of maltreatment, starting with when you are a baby, because the brothers were toddlers when Jose was holding them up on, making them hold themselves up on like a pull up bar. And poor little Erik, I can just, like in my mind's eye, I can see the picture of it because they showed it at trial. We looked at it where he was just holding on to the handle or to the pull up bar, and Jose standing a good, at least with farther than arm distance away and just smiling. And the poor little baby Erik, little toddler Erik, is looking like he's in pain and crying and miserable. And Jose looks like he's laughing his ass off. So there's that. So effects from when you are a baby and starting when Erik Menendez was a baby could make him a helpless, defendant, immature, and fearful teenager who lacked the ability to rescue himself from this life and who had been so deliberately isolated by his parents to have nobody else to turn to. Excellent, excellent, excellent summary there about that. And they didn't touch on this in the last trial, so it's really good that she brought this up this time around. So that is a difference, if you recall. I say that's a plus for the defense to get to do that over again a second time around. Evidence will show that these homicides occurred at the end of the week of crisis in this family, during which Erik Menendez's fear of his parents continually escalated as his parents' behavior and his brother's expressions of fear drove Erik into panic. We will prove to you that when Erik and Lyle Menendez took their parents' lives on August 20th, they were acting under a mind numbing, adrenaline pumping panic. And that is important with experts to show that, which we know a lot of the experts from the first trial were excluded from the second trial. Unfortunately, my superhero of true crime, Dr. Ann Burgess, will not be returning. I don't know if there was a motion. I'll have to look into that, but man, she was awesome. She helped the FBI in task force in profiling and helping in witness uh, s- trauma identification because nobody was looking at the witnesses. She was a nurse and she was seeing patterns in witnesses who were being maltreated and how they reacted from it, the trauma that they endured, the emotional part of it, where no one was studying that. Ann Burgess was, and she helped the FBI create programs based off of that. So, victim and witness identification, and she actually um, teaches classes on that too, victimology, which is, I think, crazy. I mean, crazy cool. Like, she's awesome and a rock star, in my opinion. But she's not back, sadly. Because she explained this mind-numbing, adrenaline-pumping panic very well. But that is what the brothers were in, a fear of death at the hands of their parents that they had deliberately instilled in them since the time that they were babies. What the evidence will show is that these parents, in raising these children, bring them in to something that you can see is a fortress of terror and deprivation, like how she described that. Because it is. Every little thing that Jose did, down to where he selected his homes, which were totally off the path, off the beaten path, and surrounded by gates or woods or no neighbors for miles, you know? So every little step he took, I think, was part of enacting this control over his family, over others as well in his businesses too. Nobody really liked Jose. He doesn't have any real, he didn't really have anybody sticking up for him on his behalf here. Most of the family who did speak of Jose all corroborated that he was very violent, angry, not very nice to be around. Anyways, so they controlled them with fear. Their whole life they motivated them with fear. There were no positive rewards. They guided them with threats. They intended that their sons be afraid of them every day of their lives, and they were completely successful in accomplishing that purpose and the fear that they had so carefully and systematically instilled in their children caused their own demise. This was a family where the children had no say in their lives, no friends who could rescue them, no family who had the power to intervene. They were kept in the frightened and isolated state. They were deprived of love and support. They were very deprived of love and support. We know Kitty and Jose were not loving and affectionate parents. They, if anything, you could say they were neglectful because they would let injuries go without taking them to the hospital or to an ER or something. So and Kitty would leave them in public and go off and do her thing, and the kids would get lost, and the lost and found information would be calling Kitty to come pick them up, and she would not come for a while later till she was finished doing whatever she was doing. So a lot of neglect, no love, no support. They were stripped of any sense of their own value or worth as people. They were humiliated, exploited, corrupted, and they were maltreated. And as a result of that treatment, the sins that were committed against them, and the needs that they had, which were ignored by their own parents, just like daily needs. Erik would run off and get food and love and affection from his aunt across the street when they lived in Illinois. Um, So Eric Menendez suffered from a condition common to other victims of trauma as well, and caused by the stress that trauma exerts on the human psyche. That syndrome, that condition is called post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. We all have heard that term by now, but back then, this wasn't a common thing, and not everybody had PTSD, or at least you didn't know you had it, you just were crazy. You couldn't identify it, so therefore you just lived with it and moved on, or tried to anyways. All right, and rather than keep repeating post-traumatic stress disorder to youth, rather keep repeating it, you through the rest of this, I'm going to use the shortened mental health professionals use, which is PTSD. We will hear the testimony for Dr. John P. Wilson, who's a leading researcher, and will be saying that a lot during most of our case about our experts, that they're the leading researcher. So they went off and got like some more excellent experts, I guess. We think all of our experts are leading researchers and experts in their fields, and Dr. Wilson is a leading researcher and expert in the field of post traumatic stress syndrome, and we will describe to you the crucial symptoms of PTSD that Eric Menendez manifested. And these were symptoms that had before his parents were uh, met their demise, before they met their demise, symptoms that Dr. Wilson can trace back through his history that he showed as a child. Among those symptoms, and I'm going to list them for you, but I'm not going to take the time to explain them all. Otherwise, Dr. Wilson wouldn't have any reason to be here, and it would take forever. Here's what they are. One is called hypervigilance. I've talked about this. I've suffered from this because of my PTSD and maltreatment. Hypervigilance, which means extremely alert to signs of danger or threat or punishment or maltreatment, scanning your environment all the time. What are they going to do now? What are they thinking now? What would happen next? What's their next move? Are they going to come into my room? Are they going to hit me? Are they going to yell at me? Are they going to throw something at the wall? All those things you're looking for in your brain, and it overwires it starts to overwire you. You become a ball of like anxiety. Constant anxiety is the best way to put it. And you're constantly looking for the next thing that's going to hurt you. So it's it's a real thing, hypervigilance. Look it up. And you might even have it and not even know that you have it, or didn't know that that's what it was called and that you were suffering from it. But that is very common in these cases. All right, so children and Eric Menendez, we assert, live in that constant state of fear. Okay, what's going on or what's going to happen next? What is called hypervigilance. Another symptom is called hyperarousal, which means that one of these cues they're worried about, one of these cues that something bad is about to happen occurs in their environment, they go from zero to panic very, very quickly. It's like your body remembers how to be in survival mode instantaneously, and your heart starts pumping. You get real nervous. Your reaction might be fight or flight or flee, whatever it is. That's what's happening. And your body can get there very fast because your body remembers it. It's all out of memory because you've been here before. They've been yelling at you for something that wasn't your fault before. So all of a sudden, they start to get angry or a little edgy, and then you start to get tense. Another one of these symptoms is called helplessness, and it's sometimes called learned helplessness. All children initially are helpless, makes sense, but people who are raised in extremely domineering and environments with maltreatment develop a sense of their own helplessness that is debilitating. It, like I said, you feel trapped, you feel lonely, you feel like um, like there's nowhere to go, there's no help, and anything you do, they'll find you or they'll stop you or whatever, or you don't even have the ability to do it yourself, basically, because they've been doing everything for you. The homework part, like, okay, if I get rid of my parents, how am I going to do my homework? That would be, more logical than they were doing it for this inheritance that they weren't going to get until later, even though all of their financial wants were being taken care of. So I don't know. Sorry, I'm rambling again. Let's move on. They can't think their way out of a difficult situation. They don't have the confidence to believe that they can take care of themselves, that they can rely on themselves, that they can solve these kinds of problems. A fourth symptom that he suffered from is more commonly known to you all. I'm sure it's depression and the thoughts of self deletion that depression can lead to. And Mr. Wilson will tell you there's a documented history of self-deletion ideation on Eric Menendez's part long before on Eric's part, but long before his parents were taken. So he was feeling like he no longer wanted to live long before the homicides, and that is due to the maltreatment. In day to day life, another symptom of PTSD is pervasive anxiety. People who live constantly on the edge, constantly fearful. Another symptom that Eric Menendez suffered from is it sounds strange because it's been pop cultured to death, but it really is important, and it's the notion of really low self worth, not thinking of yourself as anything, but garbage. And you might say, oh, low self esteem, you see it as Oprah, like an Oprah problem, I guess is what she's saying. It really is a serious impediment to, and you think, well, if you think very little of yourself, one of the other symptoms is what's called re experiencing of the trauma. And that means that bad things that happen to folks who have PTSD last can go by and something will remind them or something will even unconsciously trigger and all of a sudden they're back in the traumatic episode as if it was really happening. So they can take themselves back in that place. They relive it. I think you've all heard about that as being a phenomenon. Again, for example, of post war veterans, a Vietnam War veteran can walk down the street and a car backfires and he's back in the TET offense. I don't know what the TET offense is, or in the offense. He's not doing it on purpose, he's just thrown back into the terrifying emotional state. Dr. Wilson will testify how significant it was in this case that Eric Menendez, as a person with PTSD, was experiencing a whole series and sequence of these cues that threw him back into the most terrifying traumas of his past that that very Sunday night when the shooting occurred. Other symptoms that he had was something called intrusive thoughts. So, I mean, he was suffering from all of this, guys. Imagine just one would be hard enough, but you have all of these symptoms where you can't consciously keep from your memory, even last after traumatic events happen, those memories from jumping back into your consciousness totally beyond your control. And when that happens, particularly with children, what people see is they seem to space out. They're just not there, and you can talk to them and they don't respond. And they've just lost their train of thought. And we will have several witnesses who will testify that even at 18, I mean, going back last years, but even at 18, they saw this tendency in Eric that he will suddenly go in a trance-like state and he wasn't even there to talk to. So like he just goes into a trance and it's like he's Eric left the building for a second. he'd do this in the middle of a tennis practice, in the middle of a tutoring session. This image, boom, gone. One of the other symptoms, not exclusively PTSD, but also supports that diagnosis, is having nightmares that are symbolic reenactments of the traumas. And you will hear the whole show bill, if you will, of the nightmares Erik Menendez experienced his whole childhood and especially intensively that week before the homicides. Another byproduct of this kind of stress that causes PTSD is the fact that in children who are stressed that way, they often, the children who are stressed that way, they often demonstrate learning disabilities, and Erik Menendez suffered from a series of learning disabilities that you will hear about. Dr. Wilson, who will testify about these things in some detail, has evaluated Erik and has explored his life history and the life history of his parents in order to share with you how the treatment that Erik Menendez received at the hands of his parents could cause him to have these symptoms, and how, in turn, his psychological condition could explain the fear reaction that he experienced at the time of the homicides. Dr. Wilson will explain how the events directly preceding the homicides, when viewed through the perceptions of someone with Erik Menendez's mental condition and personal history of abuse at the hands of his parents, could trigger a fear response so profound as to result in a belief in the need to use lethal force to survive. Now, I want to stop here for 1 second because I've now mentioned the fact this was a homicide out of fear a dozen times, and I just want to take you back for a moment to the jury selection process. You may recall that in the questionnaire itself and repeatedly during the jury selection process, the judge talked about the concept of actual but unreasonable belief in the need to defend. And I just want to say now, before we spend the next 4 or 5 or 6 months, but yeah, it's going to be that long, rather, or whether you like that law or don't like that law, that's the law. And the reason we're going to spend 3 months proving that Erik Menendez acted in fear and not in malice is because that law is the law of the state of California, and that law is the law that we believe applies. So they're saying the law, that's the law of the state of California is not adhering to because they're pressing these charges or charging them with the M word. So, if it seems to you that I'm making much of nothing, all I'm doing is telling you why and how that law applies in this case. And why I keep repeating the fear is because fear under that law takes away the element of malice that would otherwise act, make an act without malice. If it's fear, not malice, it's not homicide. So, without malice, if it's fear, not malice, it's not the M word. Okay, that makes sense. It should just the way I read it didn't make sense at first. All right, so now in order to understand what was done to Erik Menendez that could make him so fearful of his parents, we have to tell you the history of how he was treated by his parents. It isn't something that he wants to do, but it is something that he has to do if you are ever to understand the truth from his perspective. I want to say something else about why we're putting this evidence on. We're not just going to be putting on evidence that he was maltreated so that you will feel sorry for him. He is not asking you to feel sorry for him. Moreover, the fact that he's maltreated is not legally significant. What is significant is what the impact of that maltreatment had on his perceptions and how those perceptions led him to have this actual belief, however unreasonable, that his parents were about to take his life. So, it could be an unreasonable belief, but it is their belief. For that reason, our witnesses will not tell you that the maltreatment is an excuse for what happened, but they will demonstrate that the maltreatment that that he received explains why it happened and why it happened in the crucial factual and legal issue is the case. The prosecution's relying on evidence that they claim establishes a motive of greed and hatred, meaning he could wrap it up in talking about the mafia thing. He could wrap it up by talking about the mafia thing, and you will see if there really is any evidence in this case whatsoever that my client had any concept of mafia things before, during, or after these homicides, and this concept of a mafia style homicide to prove premeditation. But the fact of the matter is, unless you believe that my client is the kind of monster who would take his parents' lives for greed, or that he woke up one morning uh, after the last 18 years of maltreatment and decided, gee, I hate those folks. I think I'll take their lives. Unless you believe that, you cannot possibly find that this is first degree homicide. So they did not follow the law. I don't know why I'm saying it like that. I just for emphasis, they didn't follow the law. They did not follow the law. This is why the brothers should be resentenced because the jury did not follow the law. Should have been manslaughter all along, which means the brothers should have gotten out many years ago, like over a decade ago, because it's a much shorter sentence. They've been in for 35 years now. They should be out. They should have gotten out probably like 25 years or something. Then she says, so what they're really relying on here is this picture that they want to paint to you. And then Mr. Khan, for the prosecution, objects as this is argument. He says, Ms. Abramson says, I'll rephrase it. The court says, let's get to actually a summary of what you expect the evidence to be. Ms. Abramson says, so the prosecution, relying on evidence that they claim establishes a motive of greed and hatred, our evidence will show the only motive was to survive. You will see in this case that no one will ever testify that Erik Menendez ever expressed hatred for either of his parents, ever. And you will hear from the witnesses and the evidence that Erik Menendez was not at all materialistic, had no need for more than that 180 a month, which I happen to think is a lot of money for an 18-year-old. What we did a calculation for inflation for today, it was like $457 or something like that. So yeah, it was for at least 450 a week. Or was that a month? I think that was a month. Sorry, yeah, that was a month. It's still a lot. All right, so he had no need for money. He He had no bad habits for which he needed money. He never talked about getting his hands on his parents' money. He never expressed any interest in their money at all. He was 18. He was about to go to college. They were paying for it. They were generous parents. They gave their sons however much money their sons needed. They gave them a very wealthy life. That was the one and only thing that they did right by their kids was provide for them materially. And that's not saying a lot considering they had a lot of money. So, um, if that's their only redeeming quality as parents, was pretty bad. But they did. They gave them anything they needed financially. Lyle was closing on a condo and he was going to go live there and near Princeton and go to Princeton and live in his own condo in Jersey. So that was his plan. So helping his little brother totally quashed that plan. So if you want to say this was premeditated, why would Lyle do this to ruin his future? Because he had everything made for him. He had, his dad was paying for everything. Granted, on the inside, the family was in tatters and everybody was yelling and violent with everybody else. Well, not the brothers, the parents were. And yeah, not good times inside the closed doors of their home. But on the outside, they look picture perfect and they've got the money so they can't, and they were very concerned about their appearances. So that's another reason why um they wouldn't. The parents or why I don't know. I think you know where I was going with that. I got off tangent or on a tangent again, but anyways, so he was 18. He was about to go to college. They were paying for it. They were generous parents. They gave their sons however much money their sons needed. They gave them a very wealthy life they wanted for nothing. There was no reason why the evidence will show they needed any money at that time in their life. Lyle Menendez was going to Princeton University. His parents were paying for it. He didn't have to work to put him through school. The cost is a minimum of $22,000 a year. Stop there. For inflation, let's see. Yikes. Are you guys sitting down? $55,974 in today's money. Almost $56,000 in inflation. There's something that's really wrong with this country if 30 years ago, you could go for 1 year of school for 22,000 now costs $56,000. There's a problem here somewhere, but let's not get into politics and all that. Anywho, the cost is a minimum of $22,000 a year to send a son to Princeton University. Times that by 4 years, talking over $200,000 to send your son to school for a degree. Plus, he's buying his condo too. So there were no disputes in the family about whether or not their parents were sufficiently generous to their sons. Their sons had no complaints about them. No complaints about money, no complaints about them at all, which is something you'll find too on the stand in the first trial. They really, besides describing the actual events of the essay when they were children, they don't have a bad thing to say about either of their parents. Like they love them. They s- they have shown remorse, I think, to me, in my opinion, the way that they grieved and talked about the crimes on the stand and just talking about their parents. They were very complimentary when speaking of either of their parents for the most part. And that's another reason why they wanted to open the safe and to, keep things more secretive when the parents were gone. They were still trying to protect the parents' reputation. They didn't want anything to come out about the essay and how horrible it was in their home, because that would, in essence, shatter that picture perfect family that they tried to portray so much. And the one thing that they could have complained about from the time they were children, they had been sworn to secrecy, never to talk about it. Like most maltreated children, as our experts will tell you, it never occurred to them to complain of the treatment that they received from their parents because it was all they ever knew. They didn't know any different. They didn't know to say, like, hey, my dad's doing this. Is that normal? We do kind of get that with Erik because he asked, can't remember if it was his cousin or his friend, but somebody did ask that and was told, no, that's not normal. But it wasn't until like much older teenage years. So you don't start asking questions until late, much later after you're full in on the abuse. You're not, as a child, it is what it is, and you just think, okay, well, that's my life. This is just how it is because that's what my mom and dad says. And they're the ones that are the perpetrators of the maltreatment, so that makes it a little difficult for the child to get any help. All right, so the one thing they complained about was the secrecy. They had to be sworn to secrecy, never to talk. Like most children, as our experts will tell you, it never occurred to them to complain because it's all they ever knew. All they ever knew. To them, what was happening and had happened appeared normal. We will prove that this is a case with respect to Erik Menendez where a child who loved and was totally dependent upon his parents had come to the end of his rope. He could endure no more, and his response was not violence against his perpetrators, it was thoughts of violence against himself. And that is a classic sign, or is very telling, that his self-worth was very shattered because of his perpetrator, because of his parents, and that it never even crossed his mind that his parents are the ones that suck and need to be in prison for it, for the things that they're doing to him. Never crossed their mind. This is just their life. This is the way they grew up. This is just how it is. When this is the household that you grow up in, you don't question it as much until, like I said, they were more like teenagers. So he wanted to take his own life, and in that depressed state, he broke the cardinal rule of his parents and especially of his domineering father. He told the most shameful of all the family secrets, the incest secret. And that's the heart of this case. He told the secret. He told the secret to the only person near him at the time that he felt he could trust. There had been only two people in his entire life that he felt he could trust. One was his cousin Andy, who at the time, by the time Erik is living in Beverly Hills, California, Andy is living on the other side of the country, probably Jersey or with a family there, New York, Jersey area. And the other person he came to trust was his brother, Lyle Menendez. And Erik Menendez told both of those two young men, and only those two young men, that his father had been molesting him since the time that he was 6 years old. He told Andy that Erik told Andy when he was 12 or 13. But he told that to Lyle, his brother, just days before the homicides. So Andy knew since they were preteens. Because like I said, whoops, hold on, my mic thing fell off. Sorry. The brother, I don't remember what I was saying. He told that to Lyle, his brother, days before the homicides. So Andy knew about what was going on since they were preteens, but didn't really act on it. I think he did, actually. I think he might have told his mom or something. I can't remember. We'll have to maybe go back to that testimony. Andy, I believe, does testify in this trial again, so we can review that. All right, so he told that to Lyle about the essaying just days before the essay. This is what leads to the escalation of their fear. This is what launches it all. So he says it, and or he tells him in confidence, he tells Lyle about what's going on, and this was after like a blow up that had happened between Lyle and Kitty, in which Kitty ripped Lyle's hair off. And then after that fight that had escalated, the brothers got together and Erik started confiding in Lyle about what was going on. Lyle had known about it back when they were younger, and Lyle told his dad to stop, and he had confronted him. And Jose said, okay. He said he would comply. But Lyle's now finding out that Jose lied to him and that the SA stuff it did not stop. And it's gotten probably worse to the point where it was, I mean, it got very violent sometimes. So it's awful. All right. And in telling that to his brother, set in motion a chain of circumstances that wound up in the homicides because his brother, in trying to free Erik from this intolerable situation, created a much worse one that put them both in what they perceived to be grave danger, and how they tried to live with that danger. And in fact, their inability to live with it and to diffuse it led to the homicides. Now, the witnesses we will call, who are Erik's family members, some of his teachers, people who were coaches of his and friends of the family, and of course, Erik himself will paint a portrait of Mr. and Mrs. Menendez as parents that will detail a textbook case of what the experts will call multidimensional child maltreatment. We'll call. We those words are interchangeable. All right, so these mental health expert witnesses that they're going to call are experienced in assessing mental states of people driven to take someone else's life. They're experienced in the evaluation and treatment of those suffering the effects of CA and other forms of trauma that cause PTSD. And they will tell you what the effects of maltreatment are on a child, how those effects continue, and even testify in adolescence and early childhood, and most importantly, how the child molded by maltreatment can be expected to perceive and react to the calculated threats of their perpetrators. So, violators, whatever you want to call them, another a different word than that, because for whatever reason, YouTube likes to shadow ban that word. All right, and they will be talking about a subject that's talked about a lot in our culture, but not necessarily very well understood. That the effects of abuse on children is not just during early childhood or at the time specific acts of the maltreatment are occurring, but the long-term effects interferes with the healthy development of the child, permanently changes the personality of the victims, and both at the same time enhances through their hypervigilance notion and uh, distorts through the distorting effect of fear and terror the effects of someone suffering maltreatment, particularly their perceptions of the intentions of their victimizers to harm them. What they will explain to you is that such children and adults who were abused as children are found to suffer from similar psychological defects. Some of them suffer from something called battered child syndrome. You might have heard of battered wife syndrome. I mean, it doesn't have to be a wife, it could be any domestic, like domestic partner, children, anyone in your household, pretty much. Battered person syndrome is a better term. So others develop PTSD and others suffer from other more profound mental illnesses. There are some cases in which people have borderline personalities, what we've come up to call multi-personality. Years ago, there was a book that was very popular called Sybil. You guys remember that? It was a Sally Field played her in a movie long, like might have been the 70s or 80s. Um, Definitely was before the 80s, 89, because this, well, this trial is in 96, but so it came out before 96. So years ago, there was this book that was very popular called Sybil about a young woman so tortured as an infant, so disconnected, it's called dissociated from herself, and had all these different personalities and consciences living inside of her that she was not aware were there. That's extremely rare. We're not talking about something like that. We're talking about something far closer to normal, but nevertheless extremely distorted perceptions. And that's PTSD. You will hear there's been research on CA and the effects of CA in this country which has intensified over the past 20 years in order to understand the long-term effects of maltreatment on children and that what they found to be true about the effects of maltreatment on children fits in with their earlier and sort of parallel research that's been going another on another track to study the effects of other kinds of traumas on populations of people. Wait, what? Research that's been going on another track to study the effects of other kinds of traumas on other populations of people. That's very vague and very confusing. Other than children, such as war veterans, concentration camp victims, people who have been caught up in natural disasters. Can you imagine the people in LA right now, the PTSD and trauma that they're experiencing? I'm sure, um, and devastation, just awful. They find the same kinds of psychological changes are wrought in those groups of people as in maltreated children. But they will also tell you how much more damage can be done and is done by the kind of inescapable maltreatment that occurs when the source of the maltreatment is not a stranger, not somebody shooting at you in war, not an earthquake, not even being kidnapped or buried in a bus in Chowchilla. I don't know that story. Maybe that was like a current headline or something. Where those children were carefully studied. So I guess some traumatic event where the kids were studied. This bus of Chowchilla. I've never heard of that. I might have to look into that. It's the very people who were charged with with providing love and nurturing and support and kindness to you, and they wind up being your victimizer, your parents, your caregiver. That much more profoundly influences your ability to develop in healthy ways so that as a healthy adult, you can problem solve and form relationships with people, trusting, positive relationships. You can think it, you can think your way clearly out of situations. You can control your emotional reactions. All of that is severely interfered with when you are severely maltreated as a child and an adult who was severely maltreated as a child. So those effects are lasting long into your adulthood if you ever even get rid of them. I don't know. Some horrors you can't erase. Right. So, most important is the mental health witness that will share with you the opinions that they formed after the exhaustive evaluations of Eric Menendez. They've conducted these evaluations of him over dozens of hours, and they will share with you their opinions that he manifests the symptoms and did at the time of the homicides and relates the history of a young man who suffered extreme forms. extreme forms of lifelong, intimate, psychological, and physical maltreatment at the hands of both of their parents. These opinions are based not only on their interviews and impressions of Erik, but also are supported by an extensive battery of objective psychological tests that were administered to a forensic psychologist who who has enormous experience in this area. So they've gone under an extensive battery of objective psychological tests. And you will also hear that all of the experts who evaluated Erik Menendez and also the person who administered the test to him also examined his entire history, everything we could get them so they could get everything that we could get them so they could understand what was happening. They looked at it all of his school and medical records, the records of his parents, mental and physical health care providers. They have read all of the testimony of all of the witnesses who testified in the first trial and all of the interviews and reports of statements of all of the witnesses who are testifying in this trial for the first time. They have they have seen and read and heard all the prosecution evidence that you will see and hear and read. So they're not coming into this from some ivory tower with some tiny view. They have heard as much, in fact, much more than you will hear in this courtroom, and they will share with you the things that they have studied and evaluated that are not directly before you in this courtroom. Now, what specifically happened to Erik Menendez over the course of his life and how it caused him to react the way he did on August 20th, 1989, will be the subject of the testimony of many witnesses and will take a considerable amount of time to present to you. Now, I'm going to tell you here I can offer you only a brief summary, but while it's going to take at least an hour to offer you this brief summary, it is going to take 3 or 4 months to put on all the evidence. Starting at the age of 6 and not ending until the loss of his father's life when he was 18, Erik Menendez was intimately molested by his father. And the pattern of that molestation in which Mr. Menendez engaged, you will hear from the expert witnesses, fit the model of most incest perpetrators. Because it starts out when you have a little kid like that an adult wants to foist their needs on. It starts out as a seduction. You don't want to alarm the child. You don't want to harm them right away. You don't want to scare them. You don't want them to cry. You don't want them to run off and tell someone. So, in order not to alarm the child, you tell them this is love. This is affection. This means you're special to me. This is our special time together. This is our little secret. This is what Roman soldiers used to do, son, before they went into battle. You can and you can fool a 6-year-old really easily. And the way that it started in this family was with those phrases that I just recited to you. And in addition, it began with Mr. Menendez massaging his child after athletic events. Ew. You will hear that Erik Menendez was involved in competitive sports from the time he was 3, sorry, from the time he was 3. Swimming was the early one, and then soccer, and then an overlay of tennis. So there's a point in his life when he's kind of soccering and tennising all the time around the clock. And all of our bodies, if you work hard enough, or if you work them, even the bodies of little ones will get muscle knots and muscle tension with all that activity, and that's what used to happen to Erik Menendez a lot. So his father started out massaging him, supposedly to get rid of the tension in his muscles, and eventually, within a very short period of time, he started massaging other parts of his body. his genitals in particular, and told him that was also tension reducing, and that's how the molestation began. And for several last, as his father groomed him and taught him, as his father groomed him and taught him things to do back to his father, the molestation was not violent. It started out with touching and arousal. It graduated to training the child to perform oral copulation, training the child to perform sodomy on the father. And then, when Erik got older, the sex acts, and this was particularly up to the age of 11 when the really traumatic things started to happen. The acts became violent and all of it was coerced, so it wasn't willingly. By 11 and 12, kids begin to figure out, I don't think this is just love, and they tend to not want to be forced to do things they don't want to do in general. So, yeah, that's around the time where he went and asked his cousin Andy if that was normal. And I don't think this is right. And then the way you get their continuing compliance is threats and fear and violence and punishment if you don't continue to to do what they want. The threats of death in this tell what's going on, which is obviously a game. Every aspect of it is a crime. Everything that Jose and Kitty are doing in this vein are criminals. Incest is a crime. Child molesting is a crime, and there's tremendous amount of at stake for rich and successful businessmen if they get caught doing that sort of thing. And what if it's systemic within his company and they don't want it to get out? So he realizes he has to do something about his kids. Maybe he would have. I don't know. But using it as a threat, clearly it was a threat that he was going to ask them if they ever gave the secret away. I wouldn't take that as any other way than a threat. Um, yeah. So they had to have been. It's very possible that the father could have, in my opinion, done something to the brothers. If once that the secret got out, he might have been planning something. I don't know. Not there. I'm not him. But I just wonder if maybe their irrational idea that the parents were going to come at them and take their lives, maybe it wasn't so irrational. That's all I'm saying. And that's a tremendous amount at stake for rich and successful people. So it's the kind of thing that you will hear from the testimony here that Mr. Menendez repeatedly threatened his sons never to tell. By the time Eric Menendez was 11, was 13, the molestation pattern, and it was very painful to talk about these things. It's uncomfortable to hear them, but believe me, it's harder to say them. Objection, argumentative, overruled. Your remarks or your next remarks. And Abramson says, thank you, Your Honor. The molestation pattern, including repeated acts of forcible oral copulation, forcible R word by sodomy, and the enduring of those acts while being stuck with sharp objects and cut with a knife. There were other sadistic acts besides that, which was fairly routine. Jose used to stick pins, like thumbtacks, in Eric's thighs and leg and pubic area, his genital area. Can't imagine that that was an act of love. I'll skip that. There were objects that his father used on his body that caused tremendous pain. By the time he was 13 and had enough exposure to the outside world to know what was normal behavior for fathers and sons, Eric Menendez understood that he was a worthless uh, slave for the intimate relations for who only existed to do whatever it was that his father wanted, and it made him hate himself. Not his father, himself. I mean, a boy of 13 has notions of being brave too. He's played soldier for enough. I don't know why, like, enough last. I don't know what, maybe this is something that he's played soccer for enough something. I don't know. The dialogue or the testimony keeps going like this, and I think it might be an error that the um, court reporter is doing, but I don't know what's supposed to go here. He's played soldier, let's say for long enough. I don't know. It made him hate himself that he was putting up with this. Although he was far too frightened to do anything about it, it made him ashamed. And that's another thing that happens with this. But it's so hard to admit because of the shame that you feel. You feel like people are going to judge you, and they do. People always, there's always the side that is the victim blaming side. No matter what the victim did or didn't do, they will blame the victim. So, um, it's shameful and it's hard to talk about it, which is why they never wanted to talk about it, why it didn't come up until prepping for trial and not in the investigation. He thought, as you will hear from Dr. Wilson, most maltreated children think that they did something to deserve what was happening to him. He thought he brought it down on himself, that he was loathsome in some way, that he deserved it. And he thought he would never have a normal life. And at 13, started to have very serious self deletion thoughts for the first time at 13 years old. He's still a baby. Then asked Dr. Wilson will explain, as Dr. Wilson will explain, as Erik will explain what went through his mind in order to survive this kind of situation. People who are trapped in these domestic V fortresses, these prisons, have to imagine a way to survive. They have to imagine how it's going to end. And these things, these thoughts by which victims have repeated whether it's a prisoner in the olden days, I won't say Devil's Island. Prisoners on Devil's Island, if you remember, whatever it is. When you're being tortured, you have to think of a way to fantasize a life when the torture is over. And this is called a rescue fantasy. Whoops. A rescue fantasy. So, in some way, you are visualizing or picturing your escape from your perpetrator. Either somebody is going to come and stop it, or magically it's going to end, or you're going to win the lottery, or in this case, what Erik Menendez thought at 13 and from then until 18 was it can't last forever. Someday I will go to college. The tradition in their family was you live away at school. I will get away and it will end, and I can stop being so worried that my friends are going to find out what a freak I am and what's happening to me. So he lived their rescue fantasy. He had one of these at his worst moment. It was what kept him going. But as you will hear, the problem he had surviving in this family as a child and a teenager was not limited to just the act that he was being essayed. Because as terrible as that is, that doesn't happen and then didn't happen every single day. It was repeated, it was systemic or systematic. It had happened on an average of twice a month. That's still 2 times a month too many. 2 times a month for those last 12. But it was repeated. Oops, I lost my spot. I had to take a sip there, sorry. It was repeated, it was systematic. It had happened on an average of twice a month for the last 12 months, but every single day of his life, other forms of maltreatment were there for him to try to cope with because his father was a very, very powerful, intense, and smart and charismatic man. Really quite remarkable. He had remarkable good and he had remarkable bad. But what he most had was total control and total domination over every aspect of Eric's life. He also was a kind of practical joker and tormentor who liked to trap people and liked to make fun of people, particularly people weaker than himself. And no one within his circle was weaker than his youngest son. And so Eric was constantly the victim of his father's de- depredations. I think degradations. Now, a lot of people, and you will hear about their points of view, saw and suffered from these characteristics of Mr. Menendez that can only be called intimidating. But what they also saw was his own children were in constant fear of his displeasure. They saw how obedient these kids were to him, how well behaved they were once they were old enough to understand social environments when their father was around, and people could see how charming he was, and people know how much his sons worshipped him, admired him, wanted to be like him, talked about him. His dad is so great. He came from nothing, from Cuba. He's self made, he's powerful, he can get anything he wants in the world. He's stronger than other people, he's smarter than other people, and he was scarier than other people because he indoctrinated his children into believing that he was, in all respects, a superior being. Pretty much that he was the most powerful, the most successful. He even had them believe that he was above the law, ripping up tickets in front of police officers, yelling at them and smarter than anybody else. How did that pan out for him legally wise? I'd be interested to find that out. And both he and Mrs. Menendez had their children believing that their family was superior to other families, that their emphasis was that the family credo here on winning in business and and winning in sports at all costs was acceptable values for success. I mean, they had these kids convinced that performance was the only way and the appropriate way to earn any kind of parental love and respect. Now, what happened when your performance wasn't perfect? You see, was the constant theme of your life. Children can't perform. Children being essayed rarely perform at all. There was plenty of failure as a consequence. What you will hear in Mr. Menendez's demanded and received total obedience from his children, he made sure that they he made sure that they looked to him for everything, all guidance, all decision making, and he also made sure that there was no alliance among the four members of the family. Everyone had to come to him. Everybody had to look to him. And the way he made sure that there were no alliances where other people sought support from other people in the family, he was made he made the children compete with each other and pick on each other from the time they were young, and he made it very clear to them both verbally and in the way the family was structured, that their mother was not their friend, that she was only his friend. And if they went to her with any of the complaints about him, she would immediately tell him and they'd get punished. And it worked the other way around too. If they went to him with any complaints about her, they were to be punished for complaining about her together, although he didn't seem to mind when it was in front of his face that Lyle went to go do something. Oh my God, I totally lost it. The idea just like fell right out of my head. If they went to him with any complaints about the mother, they were punished for complaining about her. So they had nowhere to go between these parents. That's what it was. He would say that if like Erik wasn't eating or something, and or wasn't like being picky with his food or whatever, and Lyle too, about complaints about her cooking often happened, and then they would leave, and at that point, like, they all thought that she was poisoning them. So so they can't go to her or go to him with complaints like, "Hey, mom's trying to off us again." We can't tell you that, but I mean, it was okay when it was Jose was being a part of it, is what I'm saying. That is okay when they are complaining about her, when Jose is the one also complaining about her cooking and he didn't want to eat it, so he would go and take the brothers out to go eat when they had those moments when he was like, I'm not eating this. Anyways, so now when we talk about what happened when Erik was 18 and we talk about the fear that he experienced there, I submit to you, as I will get to in a little bit, that on the face of it, the words that his parents were speaking and the gestures that they were making and the specific incidents that happened over the course of that last week standing alone should not have frightened anyone as badly. It should have frightened them, but not as badly as they were frightened. But when you spend your whole life with parents who let you know all the time how easily they could take your life, Mr. Khan says, I would object. This is argumentative. The court says sustained. Let's move on. So already he's sustaining objections for the state, whereas whenever Leslie was objecting during the state's argument, he often denied it. So overruled. In this case, he sustained it. All right, so Ms. Abramson says Erik is going to testify about very vivid examples of his father's potential lethality towards him. After all, during the molestation, his father would be pulling his hair while he was forcing him to orally copulate him. He's smashing him repeatedly. If he cried out for anything that hurt him, he forcibly sodomized him, and that happens when Erik was 12 years old. He waited until there was no one in the house because he knew the kid would cry. He had tried to sodomize him several times before that, and it always hurt, and Erik always begged him to stop. But on this day, when no one was home, he arred him. There is no other way to describe it, and the child screamed and cried, and screaming and crying, and it was over his father sat when it was over, his father sat him dad's on the bed and said, I told you not to scream. This is all your fault. And he hit him again. These are new details that we didn't learn. This whole section here is kind of the new details that, not that we need details, but I don't recall this ever coming out at trial one. So now that's not someone that you can ever trust. He doesn't mean it when he says he wants to take your life. But in this case, yeah. So you will hear testimony that in Erik Menendez's early adolescence, his father decided that as part of an already pervasive system of hardening his child by terrorizing him, you'll hear about the ways he did this, by purposely chasing him in frightening situations like putting him in the cemetery in the middle of the night when he's 7 and running away and listening to the kids scream in fear. His idea of teaching a kid to swim is when he's 2 years old, pulling him down to the bottom of the pool until the kid is struggling desperately and thinking he's going to drown, and you then you let go, or if you don't, someone else comes along and saves your kid, which is exactly what happened to Erik Menendez when he was a toddler. Anyways, these coping methods that were brutal Make the kid practice on the tennis court in boiling heat until the child fainted from exhaustion. Witnesses will tell you that he did that. In that whole milieu of all these types of things go on in his life, Mr. Menendez decided Erik wasn't tough enough. He had taken the child to the doctor, and Erik had received a shot, and he cried when he got the shot. And then Mr. Menendez thought that he was a sissy, and it embarrassed him. So he was going to make sure that the child never cried out from pain again. And so he started this campaign that lasted for several somethings where he would stick pins in Erik and cut him with a knife. And you will hear a description how Erik was cut, a long trailing cut down his left thigh, old and healed, that Erik will tell you occurred during this strange ritualistic training to keep him from experiencing pain. Of course, he does experience pain. All you learn from this is how not to ever express it. Yikes. And the variety of things that Mr. Menendez would use to do this were needles and tacks and wooden things and knotted things he would tie around the child's genitals. In any event, these episodes, as you can imagine, are what Erik calls the dark days of his life because they were the most terrifying part of an already pretty terrifying life. And Dr. Wilson will explain to you what happens of what kind of sadism what kind of sadism can do to a young person's mind, and what are the messages that a young person gets from that kind of treatment. It makes you deny physical pain. It forces your mind not to think about what's actually happening in your life. That's part of what causes this spacing out that we later see. Even up to age 18 in Erik's behavior. It also teaches you never to complain. Keep all your secrets buried deep inside. And that's what they did. They were a very secretive family. Nobody really confided in anybody because everybody told on everybody in that family. So Erik and Lyle, especially, were secretive. And they didn't even, like, Lyle didn't even know that the essaying was still going on until that weekend. It also teaches you never to complain, keep all your secrets buried deep inside, and of course, you also learn by putting up with this, as children are too powerless not to put up with this stuff. So, and it's your parent, and you listen to your parent. But it teaches you to hate yourself. It teaches you to think of yourself as a coward and to panic. And it teaches you to never trust adults in authority. Mr. Wilson will also describe how traumatized people, particularly those subjected to long term patterns of maltreatment, develop this sensitivity to cues. Cues are things that either remind them of a traumatic event or are some signal that a similar event is about to occur. Like, Dad went to go get the belt. That means I have to go to my room. That means he's going to come visit me and spank me, whatever, whatever the routine is. You see the first cue and you're like, "Oh, it's time. I got to get in line and do what I'm told to do," basically. Do, 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 do. And in this context, he will tell you how the events of the week of August 13th through the 20th, right up to the time of the homicides, could have been perceived by Erik Menendez, both consciously and subconsciously, as a series of cues causing him to re experience all the terror, all the fear of the death that he experienced during the worst excesses of those dark days, of those days of the R and the forced intimate relations And Dr. Wilson will tell you that people suffer from PTSD for years after the traumatic events have ended and may suffer from it for the rest of their lives if they're not treated for it. But as Erik will testify, and as Dr. Wilson will explain in his analysis of what happened to Erik over those last years, in Erik's case, the trauma never ended because the saying did not end in childhood. It wasn't something that had happened last before, that had happened before. I don't know why this word just is repeated all the time. Okay, it wasn't something that had happened before and everything was now rosy. Like, and that's a episode happened once or a few times in the past and now we're one happy family. No. The act of sodomy occurred in May of 1989. The last act of SA of any kind occurred just a few days before the homicides. Now, although he was old enough, by the time he was 18, there's so many typos in here, but I apologize. By the time he was 18, certainly to know what his father was doing to him and had been doing to him was a crime. Erik will tell you that his indoctrination through fear to keep his secret, his own shame and embarrassment. I mean, he's an 18-year-old, good looking athlete. There's no way he wants any of his friends, particularly not his girlfriend, to know what's been happening in his life. He also senses deep inside that his whole life as an athlete and all that hard work that he put into tennis so people will admire him is a sham because deep down inside he thinks he's utterly worthless. He thinks he's insignificant. He thinks or he feels helpless in the face of these kinds of parents. And he also believes his father is very successful and admired. His mother is pretty and admired. She's clever. She's a very smart woman. He thinks no one will ever believe him that these things have happened to him. He has no closeness now without any member of the family, or with any member of the family. The only person he told that he was ever close to was Andy Cano, who's a cousin on the other side of the country. His parents never allowed him to get close to the other relatives except the one of all his other relatives who he unquestionably, as he will tell you, loved the most, and that was the last person on earth that he would ever say anything negative about his father to, and that was his grandmother, because he had wonderful grandparents, his father's mother and father, who did, for the brief amount of time they had would be allowed to be alone with these children, with Lyle and Erik, spoiled them wonderfully, took care of them nicely. But this was just little visits, and he never could go to the grandmother who worshipped and adored her son, Jose, and say anything negative about his father. Probably because she was the one that was abusing him. So, with all of that, with his mother's lack of support, indeed his father was hostile towards him and had been for years, and with his sense of loyalty, and this is the hardest part to understand, as Dr. Wilson will explain to you about maltreated children, they are very loyal to their families. They are taught that their family is all that there is in the world, and particularly this family, where the children were taught how superior they all were. They are so intertwined with parents in this kind of family as compared to to a normal life that they have this tremendous sense of loyalty towards their parents and all of these things, what he thought of himself, what he thought the reaction of the world would be, how little support he had, and his isolation, all this conspired to prevent him from seeking help in stopping the maltreatment from outside the immediate family. Now, it would have been enough if all he had to deal with in his life as he will tell you, was this very cruel and domineering and perverse father. But his father, unfortunately, wasn't alone. I mean, I think you can imagine, and Dr. Wilson will describe this for you, that there are many, many, unfortunately, incestuous families and families where maltreatment takes place. But in so many of them, there's only one parent who is the perpetrator, and the other parent is either also a victim or tries to ameliorate the maltreatment, has the strength to make it better. So, you know of families where one parent may have a drinking problem, but the other is perfectly okay, and there's a balance, and the children may have problems, but they can grow up normal. But you have to ask yourself, in a situation where both parents where both parents have their lives taken by both of their children, that's a big clue that both parents were so I want to say that word maltreated their children so badly that there was no relief for these children within the family. Mr. Khan says, "Objection, Your Honor, it's argumentative." Court says, "All right, this is argumentative, so let's move on, please." Miss Abramson says, "All right. What the evidence in this case will show is that Mrs. Menendez was not a passive observer of her husband's abuse of the children. She was a perpetrator of both physical and psychological maltreatment herself, and she was a knowing accomplice. I'm going to highlight that because she said it twice. A knowing accomplice in her husband's incest towards Erik Menendez. In fact, she was also a knowing accomplice in her husband's incest towards Lyle Menendez because it did not start with Erik. Now, what you're going to hear from Dr. Wilson and other experts in this case is some of our assumptions about the fact that motherly love is natural may be wrong. Because based on their research and the histories of what they know about maltreated children, they have learned that some mothers cannot and do not, they cannot and they do not love their children. Some are indifferent, some are hostile, some are too selfish and too self-centered to care. And Mrs. Menendez, well, will prove, even though her children loved her, was one of those deficient mothers who resented her children. She was she was very jealous of Mr. Menendez's attentions towards anyone. So, you may recall Jose has an affair, and Kitty goes a little nuts and takes a trip to New York to go and see her and follow her. Like, not just go do a little, reconnaissance or whatever. She actually went there and was with the intention to follow this woman that Jose was sleeping with, who wasn't Kitty. So, can you imagine how she felt? Jose was choosing his sons over her. She resented her kids. She treated them like garbage. She told Lyle repeatedly, many times, that she didn't want him, that he ruined her life, all the horrible things that a parent should absolutely never say to a kid. She said them. So don't feel bad for her. A lot of people, I get on a high horse when people start saying, well, what he did to poor Kitty. Yeah, poor Kitty wasn't a poor Kitty. She was an accomplice. And when Lyle Menendez was born, Mr. Menendez became very involved in dealing with Lyle and eventually very involved in unhealthy ways in dealing with Erik. And Mrs. Menendez had her own extreme needs and resented her children for taking her husband's attention away from her. That's a big key. She really did. If you watch the first trial, she did not like anybody else getting Jose's attention for 1 minute. She had a tendency over the years, as you will hear the relatives and Erik Menendez testify, to take out her frustrations and her disappointments on her children. She also shared, philosophically, her husband's view that brutalizing children could make them tough and would make them the kind of performers who would win trophies for their parents and would thereby increase their parents' prestige in the world. So it's all for their own parents' prestige, it's not for the brothers, it's not for their own desires, their own goals, their own whatever. It's for the parents. You are going to see in these horrible crime scene photographs all the gore that, believe me, the prosecution will trot out in front of you. You will see, however, the irony of ironies that in the scene itself, the den of the house, there is a bookcase across the far wall, and every square inch of the top of that bookcase is filled with the trophies that the Menendez brothers won for their parents. The evidence will show that Mrs. Menendez ran her home like a labor camp. She made her children, I mean, military school or something. I don't know. She made her children ashamed of their academic shortcomings, and these stressed out, anxious kids had plenty of those, uh, plenty shortcomings. She made them ashamed and punished them for athletic defeats, even when they were little kids, even when it wasn't a big competition. And she made all failures on their part, no matter how insignificant or small, a secret that the rest of the family, the children, were told. Now, don't tell your Aunt Terry about your real grades in school, or don't tell your Uncle Carlos that you didn't win that tennis match. She made her children lie to the rest of the family so that they would think that everything in this family was perfecter than perfect. The evidence well shows that 3 days before she died, 3 days before she died, Mrs. Menendez admitted to her son Erik that she knew all along that Jose was doing what he was doing. Now Erik had never told her, and he will tell you that one of the reasons he never complained to his mother about his father's essaying was because he felt sorry for her. She always seemed so unhappy. She always complained so much about her life, and Erik, particularly when he really knew and understood in puberty what was going on between himself and his father was wrong, and when it occurred to him that he should go to his mommy and tell her what was going on, he already had lived in this family long enough to hesitate because he had two conflicting ideas. He will tell you about his mother. He loved her. She was his mother. She was a pretty woman. And he wanted to believe that she loved him. And he thought at times that if he told her that this mommy that he wanted to believe loved him, she'd be upset because she's his mom and she loves him. And she would confront his father, and then mommy would get into trouble. And that was the mommy he wanted to believe she was, the one that would tell and get in trouble for him. And he didn't want her to get in trouble, so he just kept his mouth quiet. But then another voice would pop into his head because so much was going on in this home that mommy did not get upset about and that mommy did not confront daddy about. And in his child's fantasy, Erik thought of his good mommy as maybe the mommy who would leave dad. But that wasn't really a good thought for his kid because this was a family where the children were told this is the greatest family in the world and we are the greatest parents in the world. And therefore, he would be destroying this wonderful family. This is how you confuse a kid perfectly by just maltreating them. But the other scenarios in his head, the scenario about the real mommy that he had to deal with every day, was even worse because what if he told her and she didn't believe him? What if he told her and she wanted to believe him and she went to his father and his father denied it and she didn't believe him? Because the fact of the matter is, in all the cruel things that were being done in the family, his mother never protected him. I'm going to repeat that. His mother never protected him. Like I said, she was a neglectful mother since they were children. She would leave them in stores and have to be called to come get them. She would drive recklessly, erratically, at very high speeds for no reason with the brothers in the car, making them scared to be driven around by her. She had fits of rage where she'd start throwing and yelling and she'd throw things in the house and she never protected them. She never objected to the father's anything. She always acted as if she believed in all the things his father did, in all other aspects of the cruel treatment. But the worst situation of all that he could imagine at 11 and 12 when he wanted to tell her was what if she did believe him and didn't care. That's probably like the harshest one. Or believed him for bringing it about, or blamed him, sorry, for blamed him for it happening. So there's a lot of reasons why he didn't want to tell his mom, but he found out that she knew. And these, Dr. Wilson will tell you, are the classic conundrums, the classic thoughts of maltreated kids, and why most maltreated kids don't tell. There's a whole bunch of reasons. You don't want to get the one person or the person that you tell in trouble. A lot of times there are the threats of, if you tell anybody, I'm going to hurt you, hurt someone else, hurt whatever. So they will use whatever tactics, threats they feel like. However, for years, Erik Menendez would suspect things would happen and he would suspect that his mother knew what was going on. Besides the fact that it was always going on, it's going on in the house, it's going on in the vacation homes, it's going on when she's there, it's going on before dinner, it's going on at midnight. It's going on in a quiet house. There were clues that she knew. She never came in his room to see him, to get him to do anything, to tell him it was dinner time, to check on his homework. If his father was in there doing things with him, other times she'd come in with the door closed. She wouldn't let anybody else who was there there were other relatives, children of cousins, basically of the Menendez brothers who would stay with the Menendez family from time to time, and they were always warned if Erik or Lyle are in a room with their father, don't go near it. Don't go down that hallway. Don't go near them. Because of the oral copulation that was occurring, resulting in his father ejaculating in his mouth, Erik would throw up a lot after these things happened. His mother never came to the bathroom, as we'll show you in the Pennington house where much of this went on was only 2 doors away from her bedroom. You have to know. And here as a kid, sometimes in the middle of the night or on weekends throwing up, and she doesn't go near the bathroom. If he had the flu or if he threw up not following a visit with his father, she'd be there. Interesting how she would be selectively helping him. You sick again, but not if he threw up after an act of his relations with his father. For some reason, Mr. Menendez, an extremely busy executive who got phone calls at home all the time, never ever did his mother come to the room and knock on the door and say to his father he had a phone call during any of the any of these events. But Erik chose to believe that she didn't know, and whenever a thought like that would cross his mind, he would dismiss it and say, "No, my mother wouldn't know, or couldn't know. My mother couldn't. She would do something if she knew. Of course, you're in that denial. Like she can't know. She would stop him if she knew. There's no way she would let that happen. But that is that is thinking that she might not already have taken sides. So the problem was, though, that his mother, independent of this molestation, independent of being an enabler of it, was a very angry and unhappy woman, and she seemed to show this anger most frequently during or towards her boys. She had uncontrollable rages at Erik and Lyle. I mean, she'd just fly off the handle for little things. She would throw things at them. When Erik was ill, she didn't comfort him because that was a sissy thing to do. You know, that would not make him tough enough to be the kind of competitor that he and her husband wanted him to be in the world. Like when you feel like garbage and someone you love or a dog or whoever comes up to you and snuggles with you or shows you some kind of physical touch or, physical comfort. That's like the best feeling when you feel like crap and somebody gives you a comforting hug or they just cuddle with you or whatever. Yet these children aren't allowed to have that feeling of comfort because that makes them a sissy. They're not allowed to be comforted because they got to be tough. Tough guys. If he stayed home from school saying that he was sick, she would accuse him of being a sissy and lock him in the closet while she was out and ran errands. She locked him in the closet. And she didn't want him to leave the closet because she didn't want him to watch television. He If he was so sick, he could stay sitting in the dark. And she'd put things across the door of the closet so she'd know when she came home if the door had been open. Wow. And she'd been gone sometimes for half the day, and there were no toilets in the closet. So the child was faced with the choice of going out and going to the bathroom and getting punished, or staying in the closet and making a mess. And finally, because she also would make him do homework in the closet if she thought that he hadn't listened to her instructions on how to do it carefully enough, he finally devised a scheme where he would take plastic bags in the closet with him, where he was living a good where he was living a good portion of his life, so he could, perform natural functions in the closet and not get punished for trying to get out and go to the bathroom. This was a woman who was a fifth grade school teacher. So yeah, she had young kids. Unbelievable. But with her own son, Erik Menendez, who she took it upon herself to tutor in this grammar school days, she criticized constantly for his poor schoolwork. She called him stupid and dummy. Again, she thought the way to do homework was to lock him in a closet. She would try to teach him things by timing him with a stopwatch. And of course, eventually it became known to her because the schools told her that Erik was dyslexic and had other learning disabilities, and he wasn't stupid and he wasn't a dummy. He just couldn't do work the way she wanted him to. But the problem was, even though the school told her that, she never told Erik. So she kept on pushing him for not going to, for not doing his schoolwork, hitting him on the back of the head if he decided to, if he didn't get it right. Sorry. I'm wavering. It's because I've been doing this for so long now and we're about at that middle point. So let me finish up this topic and then we'll move on. So So he found out she found out he was dyslexic and he had other learning disabilities and he wasn't stupid and he wasn't a dummy. He just couldn't do the work the way that she wanted him to. But the problem was, even though the school told her that, she never told Eric. So she kept pushing him for not doing his schoolwork, hitting him on the back of his head if he didn't get it right, tearing up his papers if he tried to do the work as she directed it. Now, that's what's called psychological maltreatment. I mean, it sounds like nothing, but if you get treated like that every day of your life. Mr. Khan says, "Objection, Your Honor. This is argument." The court says, "Counsel, stop arguing the case and just present what you." Oh, sorry. This is what the stupid judge says. Says, "Counsel, stop arguing the case and just present what you expect the evidence to be." Ms. Abramson says, "I'm not telling you this is truth. I'm telling you this is what witnesses are going to testify because I don't know this either. I'm just a lawyer. I learned this from what I hear from experts, and that's why we call experts to testify in trials." Your Honor, I'd like to have a break at this point. The court says, "No, let's keep going. You said," and Ms. Abramson says, "Then I'd like to walk over there and get my cup of tea." Court says your opening statement would be an hour and a half, and you're about an hour and 15 minutes into it. Miss Abramson says, "I get punished without a break because I'm late." No punishment. This is your time estimate, and you're 15 minutes away from completing your opening statement. Abramson says, "I'm afraid I'm not going to complete it in 15 minutes." He says, "You better keep going and do it in 15 minutes." I'll sound like one of those chipmunks if I do it like that. Court says, "No, you'll just speak more concisely." Abramson says, "Okay." And at that point, this is where I'm going to leave off and we'll start right back here for part two. Let me know what you think about Miss Abramson's opening statement. So far, I like it. It's different than the last one. She points out a lot of things. Like, I really do think that she learned from that group, the jurors, and she's applying what she learned because she's bringing up some really excellent points that weren't focused on a lot in the first trial. So I'm interested to see how this goes, especially since we have all new different experts and people. For the most part, the state's witnesses are all the same except a couple, but the defense has a lot different of a case. So that one will probably read a lot more. But, anyways, thank you guys so much for joining me. I appreciate each and every one of you. I hope you have a great rest of your evening, and I will see you guys for part two coming. This is airing Thursday, so I'll see you for part two of Erik Menendez's opening statement on Tuesday. So Tuesdays and Thursdays, join me here on my YouTube channel. I also post my videos on Rumble just to have a backup. Um, but I am on Rumble too, and go check that out. So thank you so much. Hit the like button on your way out, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye now.